They call it opportunity. You call it debt. The system calls it control. Debt is not a mistake in the system. It is the system. Every mortgage, student loan, and credit line turns ambition into predictable servitude. In this episode, we dissect how financial institutions manufacture the illusion of access while ensuring permanent dependency. Learn to see credit as a behavioral leash and how to cut it without retreating from growth. Welcome back to the channel. This is not motivational advice. It is structural awareness, the insight that separates those who participate in the system from those who direct it. Subscribe to the Shadow Economist to understand financial architecture, corporate strategy, and the psychology of wealth. At some point, you were taught that debt is a tool, a stepping stone, a temporary inconvenience on the path to something better. Education first, freedom later. Mortgage now, stability later. Credit today, abundance tomorrow. It was framed as sacrifice with purpose, as patience with a payoff. But there is a paradox buried inside that promise, one that most people never stop to examine. If debt is meant to lead to freedom, why does it so reliably produce dependency? Why does every major life milestone now require permission from a lender? Why does ambition increasingly arrive pre-packaged with repayment schedules, interest curves, and compliance requirements? Why does the future feel mortgaged before it even arrives? The unsettling truth is this: the debt was never designed to liberate you. It was designed to stabilize the system by stabilizing your behavior. Debt is not primarily financial. It is psychological. It does not just extract money. It shapes decisions, limits risk tolerance, and narrows imagination. Once you are in debt, your life reorganizes itself around predictability. You choose safety over sovereignty, continuity over possibility. You don't just owe money, you owe consistency. And consistency is the most valuable resource any system can extract from a human being. From the outside, debt looks like access. Inside, it functions like a leash, invisible, socially accepted, self-enforced. The brilliance of the debt system is not that it traps people. It's that it convinces them they chose the trap themselves. Most people don't experience debt as oppression. They experience it as adulthood, responsibility, progress. They take pride in managing it well, as if discipline within the cage is a form of freedom. They say things like good debt and smart leverage, repeating language borrowed from institutions that profit from their compliance. And the system smiles, because the more fluently you speak its language, the less likely you are to question its architecture. The problem is not that people misunderstand interest rates or repayment terms. The problem is that they misunderstand what debt actually represents in a modern economy. Debt is no longer a temporary imbalance between borrower and lender. It is a permanent condition engineered into the structure of life. Housing, education, healthcare, even basic consumption, all increasingly priced beyond direct ownership, nudging individuals toward financing as default participation. This is not accidental inflation. It is behavioral design. When access is gated by credit, obedience becomes rational. You can't afford disruption when your future income is already spoken for. You can't afford rebellion when missed payments carry consequences. You can't afford long-term thinking when short-term solvency dominates every decision. Debt turns time itself into collateral. That is why the system encourages you to borrow early, student loans before you understand money, credit cards before you understand discipline, mortgages before you understand freedom. By the time awareness arrives, the structure is already in place. The payments are already scheduled. The margin for experimentation is already gone. And then you're told, the problem is you. You should budget better. hustle harder, optimize your spending, improve your credit score, as if the issue were personal irresponsibility rather than systemic dependence. This inversion is critical. Systems of control survive by individualizing blame. If debt feels heavy, it must be your fault. If freedom feels distant, you must not be disciplined enough. The architecture remains unquestioned, while the individual internalizes the failure. But look closer. Entire economies now rely on consumer debt to function. Growth depends on borrowing. Stability depends on repayment. Markets assume that millions of people will continue waking up, going to work, and servicing obligations they cannot exit without consequence. Your debt is not a side effect of the system. It is a structural pillar. Banks don't fear your defaults as much as they fear your independence. A person without debt is unpredictable. They can walk away. They can pause. They can say no. They can think long-term. They can absorb volatility. They can choose asymmetry. A person with debt must remain legible, trackable, scheduled, employed. They must produce cash flow on demand. They must remain inside the lines. This is why the system celebrates creditworthiness more than capability. A high credit score doesn't mean you're wealthy. It means you're compliant. It means you've demonstrated a history of predictable behavior under obligation. You've proven that you will prioritize repayment over optionality. From the system's perspective, that is trust. Debt doesn't just finance purchases, it finances forecasting. It allows institutions to model your future, to predict your movements, to securitize your obligations and trade them as assets. Your promise to pay becomes someone else's investment vehicle. You are no longer just a worker, you are a revenue stream. And because this process is abstracted, buried under apps, statements, and normalized language, it doesn't feel violent. It feels administrative, quiet, professional, civilized. That's the genius of modern control. It doesn't arrive with force. It arrives with convenience. Swipe here, sign here, just initial there. The illusion deepens because debt often does improve short-term conditions. You get the house, the degree, the lifestyle, the upgrade, the access, and for a while, it feels like progress. But what you don't see, what you're not meant to see, is the long arc. Debt compresses your future into obligations set by your past self under limited awareness. It freezes you in a version of yourself that no longer exists. 10 years later, you are still servicing decisions made by someone who didn't yet understand the system. And exiting those decisions often requires penalties severe enough to deter escape. This is how control persists without coercion. The system doesn't need to stop you from changing. It just needs to make change too expensive. And this is where the illusion becomes complete. You're told debt is neutral, just math, just finance. But in reality, debt is directional. It pushes behavior towards stability, conformity, and incrementalism. It discourages risk that doesn't align with institutional timelines. It favors careers that pay steadily over paths that compound slowly. It rewards obedience disguised as responsibility. This is why so many people feel trapped without knowing why. On paper, they're doing everything right, earning more, advancing, paying down balances. And yet, freedom feels no closer. In some cases, it feels further away. Because the metric they're optimizing is not freedom, it's survivability within the system. And the system is very good at rewarding survival. What it does not reward is sovereignty. Debt ensures that most people will never experience true optionality, the ability to stop, reassess, and reposition without immediate consequence. It ensures that even dissatisfaction becomes manageable rather than explosive. You don't revolt against a system when you're one missed payment away from collapse. You adapt, you rationalize, you endure. You call it adulthood. From a Machiavellian perspective, this is elegant design. The most stable power structures are those that convert ambition into self-regulation. The individual becomes both prisoner and guard, no enforcement required. From a Stoic lens, the tragedy is not the existence of debt, but the unconscious surrender of agency it induces. People trade long-term autonomy for short-term relief without realizing the exchange rate. And once that trade is made at scale, entire populations become governable through incentives rather than force. This is why debt is expanding, not shrinking. Why forgiveness is debated but rarely structural. Why access keeps increasing while ownership keeps receding. The goal is not to eliminate debt. The goal is to normalize it as the cost of participation. To make freedom feel unrealistic. To make dependence feel mature. But here is the fracture point. The detail that cracks the illusion if you stare at it long enough. The institutions that lend do not live by the same rules as those who borrow. Corporations operate on leverage without personal risk. Governments issue debt without repayment timelines comparable to individuals. Banks create money through lending rather than earning it. At the top, debt is flexible, strategic, and abstract. At the bottom, it is rigid, moralized, and enforced. Same word, different reality. Which means the problem is not debt itself. The problem is who is allowed to use it without becoming owned by it. And that distinction, that asymmetry, is where awareness begins. Because once you see debt not as a financial obligation, but as a behavioral instrument, you stop asking how to manage it better and start asking a more dangerous question. Who benefits from my predictability? And why was my ambition only made possible through dependence? Once you see debt as architecture rather than accident, the rest of the system comes into focus with uncomfortable clarity. The question stops being whether debt is good or bad and becomes why it is distributed the way it is, enforced the way it is, and forgiven only when its burden threatens the stability of those who issue it. Modern financial systems do not simply respond to demand for credit. They manufacture it. They shape environments where borrowing feels inevitable and abstaining feels irresponsible. Prices rise faster than wages, not by coincidence, but because credit fills the gap. When purchasing power erodes, debt preserves consumption, and consumption preserves the system. This is why debt is sold as empowerment. Own now, pay later. Invest in yourself. The language is aspirational, almost moral. Borrowing is framed as belief in your future, as confidence, as self-trust. But belief without leverage is just exposure. The system does not lend based on your potential. It lends based on your future compliance, your income stability, your likelihood to remain legible, to stay employed, to stay inside predictable lanes. Debt is extended where behavior can be modeled and extracted from with minimal friction. This is why unconventional paths struggle for financing, why creative risk is punished, why autonomy is expensive. The system does not fear failure as much as it fears unpredictability. A borrower who might stop playing the game is a liability. A borrower who must keep playing is an asset. At scale, this produces a population optimized for service rather than sovereignty. People don't just work to live, they work to maintain access, to avoid penalties, to preserve creditworthiness. Their choices narrow without force. Their horizons shrink quietly, And then the system presents this as normal adulthood. You buy the house because renting feels like waste. You take the loan because education is framed as mandatory. You carry the balance because life keeps moving. Each step feels rational, sensible, responsible. But responsibility to what? Not to yourself. To the structure that monetizes your future. Debt works because it aligns institutional incentives with human psychology. Humans fear instability more than they desire freedom. They prefer known discomfort over uncertain possibility. Debt exploits that bias. It trades anxiety for obligation, chaos for routine. It offers emotional relief in exchange for long-term constraint. This is why many people defend their debt. They identify with it. It becomes proof of seriousness, of maturity, of belonging. Questioning it feels like questioning the entire life they've built. And so, the illusion sustains itself. From the top, the system looks efficient. Cash flows are predictable. Risk is dispersed. Defaults are priced in. From the inside, it feels heavy but survivable, which is exactly the point. A population under tolerable pressure is easier to manage than one in overt distress. Debt ensures tolerable pressure, but power never uses only one mechanism. Debt works in concert with time, narrative, and shame. Time locks you in. Narrative convinces you it's normal. Shame keeps you quiet when it fails. If you struggle under debt, you are told you mismanaged it, that you overreached, that you should have known better. Structural critique is replaced with personal guilt, and guilt is paralyzing. It turns outward analysis inward. It keeps the system intact. Meanwhile, at higher levels, debt is reframed as leverage. It is strategic, tax-advantaged, negotiated, flexible. Entire corporations operate permanently in debt, rolling obligations indefinitely while extracting value far beyond repayment. Governments issue debt with no intention of settling it in any traditional sense. Central banks expand balance sheets without personal consequence. Debt is only a moral failing at the bottom. This asymmetry is not hidden. It is normalized, and normalization is the most effective form of control. So what does it actually mean to break free? Not to reject all debt reflexively. That's not strategy, that's reaction. The post-Stoic strategist does not moralize tools. He studies who controls them, under what conditions, and at what cost. Freedom is not the absence of debt. It is the absence of behavioral captivity. The real danger is not owing money. It is needing the system to remain stable for your life to function. It is designing a life so fragile that a single disruption collapses it. Debt amplifies fragility when it consumes optionality. The strategist asks different questions. Not, how do I pay this off faster? But, what decisions does this obligation prevent me from making? Not, is this affordable? But, what future does this commit me to? Not, is this normal? But, who benefits if this becomes universal? Power begins where dependency ends. This does not mean retreating from ambition. It means restructuring ambition so it compounds instead of constrains. Building margin, reducing fixed obligations, preserving flexibility, increasing the ratio of earned time to obligated time. It means treating debt like fire, useful when contained, destructive when it spreads into every room of your life. Most people never ask how much of their future is already sold, how many years of emotional energy are pre-allocated to maintenance, how little room they've left for reinvention. The system counts on that blindness. But awareness changes posture. It slows decisions. It introduces friction where impulse once ruled. It reframes growth not as accumulation, but as resilience. The wealthy understand this intuitively. That's why they protect liquidity, not lifestyle. Why they avoid personal guarantees. Why they separate identity from obligation. Why they ensure that debt, when used, accelerates control rather than consumes it. They don't borrow to live, they borrow to structure. And that distinction is everything. The final shift is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look rebellious. It looks like restraint in a culture addicted to expansion. It looks like patience where others chase access. It looks like saying no without explanation. You stop confusing movement with progress. You stop mistaking approval for security. You stop building a life that requires constant permission to sustain. Debt loses its power when it no longer defines your choices. And the system feels that immediately. Because a person who can pause is dangerous. A person who can walk away is ungovernable. A person who doesn't need to optimize for approval cannot be steered by incentives. That is the real threat. Not default, not collapse, but independence. So the illusion of debt persists, not because it is invisible, but because confronting it requires a level of honesty most people are never taught to develop. Honesty about how much of their life is already spoken for, how much fear is masquerading as responsibility, how much ambition was quietly rerouted into service. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Debt stops being a number. It becomes a signal, a measure of how much of your future is already claimed. And from that awareness, a different kind of ambition emerges, one that values optionality over optics, control over comfort, structure over speed, not freedom on credit, but freedom by design. This is the illusion of debt. And once the illusion breaks, the system loses its most reliable form of control, your willingness to trade your future for access you never truly owned.